Welcome to the third class of the Intro to History course, and we will get started. Just to start off, I will revisit what we left off last class, which is this slide. We were just about the end of World War One. This was the point where the tide was turned and Germany started losing in the year 1918. The key reason why Germany started losing in this year was because American soldiers began to arrive in Europe. Germany started to realize they were sure to lose. And it was just how they were losing and when it happened. The key reason behind why they lost was numbers, because at this point it was logistically impossible for them to win. Put it this way. Germany was one nation up against the Great Britain, France, and also now the United States, because the United States had just joined the war. Germany was simply outgunned to win. As a result, Germany struggled with fighting the war during this time, and they also tried to improve their armed forces. Of course, that didn't work because you can't just improve your armed forces in the middle of a battle. In fact, Britain actually got revenge on Germany by blockading Germany. They basically sent ships to block off the coast of Germany during this time. As expected, Germany lost the war. And after the German defeat during World War I was the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was the signing of a treaty that decided how Germany would lose and what would be the punishment for Germany and the other Central Powers, including the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and also Bulgaria and some other smaller countries that decided to fight on the side of the Central Powers. These are the punishments the Allied nations agreed upon. For the Ottoman Empire, it would be territory. Essentially, the Turkish Empire would just lose land. They would lose, in fact, the vast majority of the lands that they have. Originally, they had a huge empire in the Middle East, but after the signing of this treaty, they basically only got what today's modern Turkey is. So of course, that was a really big punishment for them. Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there was a similar punishment of territory, meaning that this nation, this empire actually also lost a lot of land. They got broken up and many smaller countries formed, such as Czechoslovakia, Croatia. These small countries, they all formed because Austrian-Hungarian Empire was forced to give land away and allow them to become independent. Out of the three major powers, the power that got the most punishments was Germany. Germany was the major and the strongest fighter in the war on the Central Powers side. They got four major pieces of punishment. Four pieces of punishment are firstly blame, meaning that they had to take responsibility for starting the war. They had to admit that the whole war was basically their fault. They also had to pay a really, really large fine of $33 million. Back then, this was a huge sum of money. They essentially had to recompensate the Allies for the damages caused by Germany. Essentially, this was a huge deal for Germany at the time because it was very shameful for them to pay such a huge fine to their fellow nations, who are all European nations. The Allies also put a limit on the German army, meaning that they created limits to make sure that the German army would be too small to fight another war. Germany essentially couldn't develop its army after this. Germany also lost territories. They also got shrinked significantly in size. This is just a gallery of what the world leaders were like who signed the treaty. This is the Prime Minister of Britain, Italy, France, and the United States. These are just the major leaders of each country, of course, because they were the countries that won the war. Representatives from Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire were basically just here to sign a treaty, and they didn't really have any say on what their punishments would be. The American idea from this meeting was that they wanted to start a League of Nations. This is really interesting because the first society, international society, would help maintain peace, or at least I should say try to maintain peace. Well, I guess that kind of tells you if they were successful or not. A fun fact about this was, although it was funded by the the US actually didn't join this community. And the reason why the US didn't join is because the American Congress and the Senate couldn't agree on whether or not the US should join. there weren't enough votes to make the US join. As a result, the US never joined. This was actually a huge reason why this community never worked. He essentially had a few goals. I summarized them down here. The first goal is that there will be no wars, specifically no some kind of major human conflict. There will be no secret treaties. If you recall from World War one of the main reasons why World War I started was because of secret treaties. I'll just re-clarify what a secret treaty is. A secret treaty is basically when one nation goes to another nation, of course, in secret, of course, to say, if I get invaded, you have to help me. But if you get invaded, I'll also go help you fight off the nation. One of the reasons why World War One involved so many nations was because most of the nations in Europe, at least, signed these secret treaties with each other. One nation was invaded. Tons of other nations also had to join the war to help that nation because of the treaty. Before you knew it, it all snowballed into all nations fighting each other because of these treaties. The League of Nations basically banned the secret treaties. You're not allowed to go up to other nations, propose to help them if they help you. So that's now officially not allowed. Although in practice, it would be pretty hard to enforce this. Actually, the whole point of a secret treaty is the other countries don't know about it. There's no way of telling if some other nation signed a secret treaty. That's the reason why this could never be actually carried out, even if somehow by miracle the League of Nations actually worked, this one would never be enforced. Its most important goal is world peace, because the ultimate goal of the League of Nations is essentially to try to learn from the mistakes of World War One and to make sure that another similar battle would never happen. It would be a peaceful world of all love and peace. The last point, and yes, I felt that it was important enough to say it twice and then also underline it and bold it, because the ultimate goal of the League of Nations was to prevent another world war from happening. It was basically the first United Nations. Think of it as a smaller version and an earlier version of the United Nations. The United Nations is the League of Nations 2.0, improved version of the United Nations. It had more countries as a part of it. It also had more power. Basic foundational ideas are the same, except the League of Nations was basically only the European nations, no country else. And also the US played a role in founding it. As I said, the League of Nations failed. The reason why it failed, there were actually many reasons why it failed, but these are just some of the most important and some of the major reasons. First reason was they had a huge problem with their voting procedures. Now in the United Nations, the way that voting works is that you have these major countries on the Security Council, which there are only a few countries, and they have vetoing power, so they can veto any kind of legislation passed. And these are just major countries in the world. The rest of the nations all only have one vote. League of Nations was similar, but there was one huge difference, was that all voting had to be unanimous. All voting would have to be both anonymous and also unanimous, of course. All countries would have to agree on a certain issue for it to pass. Let's say if there were a vote about whether or not there should be another world war, because why not? In this case, the legislation actually gets passed. Every single nation would have to agree, say yes to it for it to pass. If 99% of every single nation said yes, but one nation said no, it would not get passed. Now, from a modern perspective, we all know that this isn't how voting works. Voting, it's about who's the majority and who's the minority, and the majority simply wins. But the League of Nations wasn't like this. The League of Nations was there had to be a 100% majority for something to pass through. Of course, this was a large weakness because you're never gonna get all the countries to agree on the same issue. So they essentially they were just limiting themselves, and as a result, they couldn't do anything. Currently, United Nations has a peacekeeping force, so there is technically an army of the United Nations, but the League of Nations had no army. So meaning that even if they condemned something or said that something was bad, they had no way of enforcing it, and had no way of forcing some nation to do what they wanted to do. That's the reason why this was a huge weakness. It's because nations can basically do whatever they want without punishment. We're aware of a phrase, the army is basically the tools of a country, it's the limbs of a country. It's what the country uses to do stuff, to make a difference in the world. So if you don't have an army, you can't really do anything at all because it's really hard to make other nations do things by themselves without an army. In fact, if another war happened, if you try to prevent the war, you're gonna need some kind of third-party independent army. But the League of Nations didn't have that, so there wasn't a peacekeeping force. Another reason for its failure was the US was not a part of it. So there are actually two reasons why this was a huge deal. Firstly, it just makes the organization look really bad because the United States is the founding member. It's actually the only founding member of the League of Nations. It's the country that came up with the idea, but the US didn't join. So that's sending a message that this organization isn't really effective to the world. Other countries aren't gonna be particularly enthusiastic about this either. If you founded this organization and even you're not joining it, why should we join? What tells us that this organization is actually good, it's actually worth it for us to join? The second reason was because at this point, the US was already a major player in the world. The US already had a huge amount of influence around the world. The US not being a part of it just gave this organization a lot less rallying power. US couldn't use its influence to get things done within the organization and make sure that the organization was actually functioning properly. Key reason why the US never joined was the president of the United States at the time was a Democrat. His name was Woodrow Wilson, person right here. He was a Democrat. As a result, all the Republicans were opposed to his idea of a League of Nations. Didn't get enough votes. He got enough votes to start the organization and to make sure that the organization would actually take place. But he didn't get enough votes for the US to join the organization. Another reason it failed was too lenient in general. It had too much mercy. I'll get into this later at a later time, but during World War II, there were tons of opportunities. From a modern perspective, the League of Nations should have intervened in the war, but they didn't. So they basically just allowed what other country was doing what they wanted to do. Also, there was nothing in the League of Nations that said you had to be a part of it. So countries were free to leave the organization whenever they wanted. Don't get me wrong, they weren't being forced into the organization and they didn't have to stay in the organization. For the vast majority of the course so far, we stayed on the topic of what has been happening in Europe. Now, for the first time, we'll be taking a look across the Atlantic Ocean in North America, or more specifically in the United States. Just some background information on what the United States was like at the time. This period was called the Roaring '20s. There was huge economic prosperity in the US. The key reason why the US was so rich at the time, and in fact, the US probably gained the most from World War I. The US made a really good move, and that move was that they didn't join the war in 1914 when all the other nations were joining the war, but they rather joined the war in 1917. The war was almost over. Think about it this way. The World War I ended in 1918. The US only joined in 1917. That means that when the US joined, all the other nations in Europe have been fighting for 3 years already. If you know economics, it's basically just common sense in history, to be honest. Wars are not really good for a nation because if you're fighting a war, then any money that goes towards the war is money that you could have spent on developing your economy, making your country better, and building infrastructure and all kinds of good uses for the money. But instead of putting the money to those uses, you decided to spend it all on a war that causes destruction. And this actually is the #1 reason why countries today all prefer peace, no war, because fighting a war is not good for anyone. All the nations were getting destroyed by World War I. US was selling weapons and making money from the war and benefiting off of the war. As wrong as that sounds, that's actually a pretty good idea. Another reason why the US was benefited from the war and didn't receive as much damage as Europe did was because that fighting a war, you always want the war to not be on your soil. At least in terms of damage, it would do less damage to you if the war was not being fought on your soil, because the war was going on in Europe. All the buildings in Europe were getting destroyed. All the grounds were being set on fire. All the villages were being completely liquidated. This was all happening. The US just had to send troops across. Hosting ground of World War One was not in the US, it was in Europe. So it was Europe that was getting destroyed. Well, the land in the US was fine. You could be in the US, the Atlantic. The house and the areas around you, you wouldn't see a difference as if the war had not happened at all. But in Europe, it was just destruction everywhere. So that's the reason why there was this huge process of economic prosperity directly after World War One. One of the indicators of this was that stock prices rose. There were a lot of Americans, individuals from all across the world who were buying stocks at this point. Stocks was, for the first time, a very, very popular occupation. Some economists, some bankers were selling and buying stocks. They were trading stocks for a living. Basically, their job, they would walk in and trade stocks and actually make huge money. At the time, stocks were get rich. Just the hype. It was just buying stocks, selling stocks. In fact, it was such the trend, and this was a huge mistake actually, but they didn't know it at the time, that some actually borrowed money to buy stocks. Every single neighbor to the right of my house, to the front of my house, they're all buying stocks, but I'm too poor to stocks. What do? I go to a bank, borrow money from the bank, and then use the money to buy stocks. But get into why this is a bad idea. You never do this. In 1929, stock prices suddenly decreased. Basic stocking knowledge. I will just give an introduction to how stocks work. The way stocks work is that buy a certain share of a company. That percentage that you bought of the company is yours. It's your property. The whole point of buying that share, it's not to own the company. Well, but you can technically brag that a part of the company is yours. But the point is to sell it to some other person and to make money. If the stock prices rose, if they became more expensive, then that's good news for you, because if you bought a share of the company for $5, and then when you sold the share, it was $7, then you just made $2 from that transaction there. So you want the stock prices to be rising when you're selling it. So this was what was happening. But in 1929, this changed. All the stock prices from all different companies suddenly all went down, and they were decreasing. As a result, the stock owners all decided to sell their stocks. About it, if you bought a stock for $5 and now suddenly the price of the stock is $2, then you just lost $3 there, because if you sell it to someone for $2 but you bought it for $5, you're losing money. You're not even compensating for how much it cost to buy the stock in the first place. As a result, everyone was busy selling their stocks because they were afraid that stock prices were gonna drop even more. If you were gonna lose $3, it's not really that big of a deal. But if it was to drop to $1, you will be losing $4. And now that's a huge deal for you, because you want to make the best of the situation. So they were selling their stocks. Once they sold their stocks, they were not saved. It was just making the best of a really, really bad situation. Because remember that many of these stock owners, they may seem rich, but they borrowed money from the bank to buy these stocks. They couldn't return the money they had loaned from the bank. Let's say if I borrowed $5 to buy from the stock market, I sold the stock for $3 because that was just the price of the stock after average prices all went down. The stock is not mine anymore, but I borrowed $5 and I only made $3. I can't return the $2. This may seem really, really weird to you, but keep in mind that some of these stock owners, they sold everything. They sold their house, sold their car, everything. They got all the money that they had, and they put all that money into the stock market. So their lives were essentially in the stock market. And as a result, when the stock market crashed, the whole value of their lives basically just went down. And they were losing huge amounts of money. And this wasn't only one person not being able to return the money to the bank. It was huge crowds of stock owners not and all kinds of traders to not be able to return their money to the bank. And in fact, look at this picture here of the Bank of the United States. These were all just individuals who had lost their money, were struggling to return their loans to the bank. Bank failed. If you think a tiny bit about how banks work, you're starting to see that banks rely on you going to them to borrow money. They also rely on you actually giving back that money because they're giving you money. If you're not giving them something back, they will not be making any money. And if a business, which a bank is, does not make any money, then they fail. You may be wondering at this point, if they can't return their money, then don't you just press legal punishments against these traders and these stock owners? If someone can't return their money, just seize their house, put them in jail. But you have to keep it in mind, the amount of money that these stock owners borrow from the bank are just too much for them to return. Let's say if I only have $1, but I borrowed $100 from the bank. If you seized every single thing that I own, I still will not be able to return. No matter what you did with these stock owners, these previous stock owners who had just sold their stocks, they couldn't return the money that they had borrowed from the bank. There were indications that the bank was going to fail because if the bank can't make money, then of course they're going to fail. So as a result of customers of these banks withdrew money from the banks because they knew that the bank was going to fail. So what they did to protect their money was that they withdrew money from the bank. Also, say that if a bank fails, they to a certain degree don't have to return your money. If you put your money within a bank, although this does depend on how much money you put into the bank. If the bank fails, then your money is basically just gone. Bank is it's not legally required to return your money. Some of the customers of the bank, they were aware of this, so they withdrew the money. And with their withdrawing of the money, the bank became worse. Banks even fell even more. So it was just a vicious cycle of banks failing and banks just crashing. A major bank that failed was the Bank of the United States. It failed exactly because of this process right here, this vicious cycle of decline for the bank. Just look at a graph for the effects of depression, and I will explain more about why banks are so important. 1929, depression begins in US. It technically began in 1928, or as some economists may say, even earlier. The year when everything happened, when the whole market just shut down, was in 1929. This was when Herbert Hoover took office, just slightly before this all happened. This was when the banks closed. It wasn't just one bank, it was banks. So meaning that tons of banks failed. The World War II begins in Europe. This is basically just a timeline of whole era. It's actually also a graph because it shows the US GDP during all the time. So you can see the GDP was the lowest during the Depression, and World War II actually increased the GDP. And we'll get into why this is later. But World War II actually played a huge role in fixing the Great Depression for the US. Now, you may be wondering, why are banks so important? Because banks, they do all kinds of economic policies. On the most personal, on the most basic level, tons of Americans have their money saved in banks. And actually, not just Americans, but I think it's an international thing. If you have too much money, you put it inside a bank. When a bank failed, as I said before, they're not legally required to return your money. Basically, you better pray the bank that you put your money in does not fail. Every single bank was failing. I can't emphasize enough. Banks failing wasn't just one bank failing. It was the whole banking industry basically just shut down. Everyone was losing their assets. The most personal level, all the people who had money inside the banks were getting more and more poor, losing their money to the banks because of the banks were failing. On a more economic and harder to understand level, banks make all kinds of loans, not just to individuals, but also to basically all kinds of huge companies and all kinds of governments. Banks, they don't really serve customers. Like, by customers, I mean like civilians, like you and me. Also serve larger operations like companies and all kinds of huge projects. As a result, If things fail, then when these projects happen and these companies happen, these companies have to do their projects. So they won't receive enough funding for their projects. As a result, they won't carry out these projects. And many of these projects are related to the economy. You as a company, you're doing a project that's actually helping employment because you have to hire employees for this project to happen. And if you can't carry out the project, then that means that you can't hire employees to help the project. Now we have to fix the situation. The first way to fix it was President Hoover. This was a president of the United States. He came with a policy called the Emergency Relief Construction Act, or abbreviated as the ERCA. This was his way of fixing the situation. Essentially, what he did was he created this project fund all kinds of nationwide projects. These projects, varying projects, so all kinds of projects existed with this. The first one was that they hired a lot of young workers to build trees. They also helped build all kinds of dams, highways, roads. It was public works. Public works, it's a relative term for infrastructure built by the government. And I'm not talking about infrastructure like signs and bus stations. I'm talking about huge pieces of infrastructure. We're talking national parks, dams, highways, huge infrastructures. And the reason why this would help the Great Depression was because one of the problems with the Great Depression the nation needed to solve was that unemployment was really, really high. Banks were failing, businesses were failing, companies were collapsing, and no kind of business was working. Any employees, you can't find a job in a place where every single firm, every single business is shut down, failing. The reason why unemployment was really, really bad at the time. But these projects helped this problem was that gave hiring opportunities. Essentially, these were basically just ways for the government to hire workers. You're out of work because the firm that you used to work at just failed due to the Great Depression. So how do we counteract that problem? We say basically create this new company, plants trees and builds parks. We take you in, we hire you to have a job. This was trying to fix unemployment. A second aspect of this plan, this legislation, was that it gave money to the poor. At the time, as you may guess, poverty was really, really bad. If you're out of work, then you don't have an income. You're not able to buy food. As a result, everyone was poor at this point. This act poured money to the poor. It created all kinds of programs to give money to the poor and to make sure that the poor had money. It was basically financial aid. Now, let's go back to the situation in Europe. The United States was in a point of the Great Depression. The United States was really poor during this time. Germany wasn't better off. In fact, Germany, I would say, was actually worse than the US at this point. Because think about, envision this. Envision the situation in Germany at this point. Firstly, the loss of the World War I was a huge blow to Germany's face. It was basically just a huge slap in the face. It was national shame that they just lost a war. Before the war, Germany was this respectable European nation that could sit at the same table as all of the other European nations. But now that they lost the war, they have to look at other European nations such as France and the UK, not as equals, but as someone who was lower because they lost the war. Their economy was also really bad at this point. Not only did they have the Great Depression, the Great Depression was this international thing. So it wasn't just the US. It started from the US. But because the US economy was so influential at the time, the Great Depression spread to all corners of the world. Any kind of nation that had a functioning economy was hit by the Great Depression. Unless you're some kind of village in the middle of nowhere that's completely separate, then that you were affected by the Great Depression. Not only they had the Great Depression, they also had huge fines. Remember how we discussed the punishments for Germany for losing World War I? They had these huge fines, so their exchequer and their government was completely devoid of any kind of money. Inflation was really, really bad in Germany. Inflation, it's kind of hard to understand. I'll explain a tiny bit. What's inflation? Inflation, it's if you think about money, right? The only reason why money is valuable, why money is something that you want, it's because money is rare. Not everyone has money. What stops us from taking this piece of tissue and just calling this money? Like if I went out on the street today, can I just buy something with this piece of tissue? What's the difference in terms of the physical material besides money and a piece of paper, whatever color, depending on what country you're from? This piece of paper, it's just a colored piece of paper with some drawings and words on it. The reason why money is valuable, the reason why money is different from this piece of paper is because money, it's not what everyone has. I can just walk into the store and pick up boxes, but I can't walk into the store and pick up boxes of money. That would be really, really wild dream. The whole point of money is that not everyone has money. This is not the case when it comes to inflation. Have you ever wondered, government is in charge of making money, right? Why can't the government just print money and distribute that money out into the economy? The key reason, it's because printing money would lead to inflation. It would lead to huge amounts of inflation. In fact, this is exactly what happened in Germany. The government was printing so much money because they were trying to fix the situation that it led to inflation. If every single person had $10, that $10 is not worth $10 anymore. If every single person in the country had $1 million, then $1 million, it's not valuable anymore. $1 million would have no difference from just a piece of paper right here. That's the reason why you see this picture right here of German children playing with money. The stacks of money are not valuable anymore because of inflation. Because if you walk into a German person's house, you would see this stack of money in every single person's house. So if everyone has this, then it's not worth anything. At this time, someone came to rise in Germany, or I should say a whole group came to rise in Germany. As it's commonly said, history does repeat itself. History has patterns. Although they do say you should try to learn your mistakes from history, but we humans aren't really good at doing that, and we always repeat the same mistakes in history. One of these patterns or mistakes, depending on what you want to call it, in times of trouble, one person it's gonna come up, take the initiative, and become the leader. This could either be good or bad. The government is just not doing anything. You need someone to come up and start to overthrow the government and make things better. But this is a situation when it actually went for the worse with someone coming up, and called Adolf Hitler. He was born in Austria. Technically, he was born on the border between Germany and Austria. Where he was born was in Austria, but his hometown was right next to Germany. And that's the reason why he moved to Germany from a young age. And he served as a German soldier during World War I. He was very loyal to Germany and got injured on the front lines, and he received all kinds of medals because he was a very, very, very dedicated soldier when he was fighting in World War I. And when he came back from the war, he realized that Germany had lost the war. For someone like him who was extremely passionate about his country, this was like a personal offense for him that Germany had lost the war. As a result of this, he wanted someone to blame. He wanted to blame Germany's problems on someone. He chose a group called the Jewish. He claimed that the Jewish had betrayed Germany during World War I, and that was the only reason why Germany had lost. And he also claimed the Jewish were basically stealing money from government. And so essentially he came up with all kinds of reasons for why the group called the Jewish were directly responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I. He summarized this in a book called Mein Kampf. I'm probably mispronouncing that. He wrote this book called Mein Kampf, basically talked about his reasons for why Germany lost, basically his work. And I think the title of the book is pretty self-explanatory because it literally means my struggle. He founded a party called the Nazi Party, and this would actually become the official government of Germany, but it first started off as a party. This party was primarily made up World War One veterans who were like him in that they all were really, really angry about how Germany lost the war, blamed the problems on the Jewish. This actually is the second pattern that consistently repeats in world history. When a nation has something that has gone wrong, they're in a point of emotional downfall. They're at the bottom in terms of their emotional states. In order to save themselves face, they're gonna attribute that defeat to something else. Any nation would never admit that the reason why we lost the war, it's because we lost the war. It's because of our failures during the war. They're always gonna try to blame it on someone else or some kind of group. This also exists on a personal level. This also happens across entire nations because for entire nations, they also don't blame the problem on themselves. Instead, they blame it on some other group. It's just about finding the group and making up enough reasons to say why it's that group before you have a solid group of followers. And the reason why the Nazi Party was so successful in taking control of the government at the time was because the Germans, they had just lost the war and they were all poor. So they needed someone to blame. They needed someone to hate. They needed someone to take the initiative and start to tell all the citizens of Germany that it wasn't their fault that they lost the war. And the Nazi Party saw that as an opportunity to take control of the government and give the Germans a reason for why they lost World War One, a very bad reason. Them taking control of the government led to the creation of Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany was this country, it's just Germany. Historians like to separate Nazi Germany and Germany before Nazi Germany called the Weimar Republic. There were two very separate governments in charge of the two countries. To give you an idea, Nazi Germany was very far right. The government of the nation was very far right, meaning that they were all a bunch of crazy and very passionate and fervent nationalists who believed that Germany was the best nation in the world. That's the reason why they weren't gonna the treaty. Germany couldn't produce weapons. Just as some back for this, after Germany lost World War One, in order to prevent another war from happening, as a part of the terms signed by the treaties and Nazi Germany, Germany couldn't produce weapons. Or they could produce weapons, but there was a limit. So this was to make sure that they didn't have a large army. They didn't have a huge military because you can't fight a war if you don't have enough weapons. You can't fight a war for long if your army is not strong with enough weapons. So the first thing that the Nazi Germany did was that Nazi Germany completely ignored this treaty and just started producing weapons like crazy. The mistake on the former Allies part, which in this case refers to the UK and France, was that they didn't agree to this, but they didn't say anything. Their thought at the time was that they're just producing weapons. If you try to go up to them and tell them that they can't produce weapons, that might provoke them and lead them to want to fight. But if you just let them do, if you just acquiesce to what they want to do for a moment, they might just back down by themselves. But as this turns out by history, this was a huge, huge mistake. In fact, this was one of the mistakes why World War II even started. If the UK and France hadn't stayed quiet and had confronted Nazi Germany about this, then World War II might not have happened actually. The second thing that they chronological order, this is just what they did. They expanded land, so they made their country a lot larger. In 1938, the first nation that they went to and they took over basically was Austria. The reason why this move was the first was because Austria wasn't that hard to take over, in fact. If you're not aware of culture, Austria is a smaller version of Germany. Culturally, Austria and Germany are very, very similar. Austria actually also speaks German. Austrians are basically just this related ethnic group to Germans. In fact, this takeover of Austria wasn't done by force. It wasn't they sent their armed forces to take over the country and to fight a war. The Austrians consented to this. So the Austrians agreed for their country to be taken over by Germany. There was this huge vote in Austria, and the Austrians agreed for them to be taken over by Germany. And the huge reason behind this was because at the time, the Austrian economy was also really, really bad. There was this belief in Austria at the time, by joining Germany, their economy would improve because Hitler had promised them if they joined Germany, then their economy would improve and Germany would help their economy improve. The second nation they would take over, well, not nation, I should say a part of the nation, was 1938. It was Sudetenland. Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia, actually separated into two nations, Czech Republic, or now it's actually called Czechia. They just actually changed their name. It's separated between Czechia and Slovakia. Back then, it was one nation and it was called Czechoslovakia. Germany seized a part of this country called Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland. Reason why they decided to seize and take over by force, Sudetenland has a large German population. It's a part of Czechoslovakia, but it's right next to Germany. Just like the border town that Hitler was born in, how it's right next to Germany. This border town, not a town, but it's this border region. I think Germans have been living there for many, many years, for centuries, in fact. Nazi Germany just used this as an excuse for taking over the land. At this point, England and France started to become a tiny bit suspicious of Germany. Not a tiny bit, but really suspicious of Germany. The reason why they're suspicious is because, think about it this way. First, you're producing weapons, making this huge military, and now you're taking over land from other nations. You're sending that military that you just created to other nations to take over land. They held this meeting called the Treaty of Munich. Nazi Germany said if they were allowed to take over Sudetenland, they wouldn't take over any other nations. But this was the second diplomatic mistake in terms of England and France. They really messed up with this one because Nazi Germany wasn't as nearly as trustworthy as they thought Nazi Germany was. Right after taking over Sudetenland, after this Treaty of Munich, Nazi Germany took over the whole of Czechoslovakia. And in 1939, this was the official start of World War II. Nazi Germany took over Poland. They invaded Poland and they took over Poland. In 1939, Nazi Germany finished taking over Czechoslovakia. So to reclarify, in 1938, they just took Sudetenland, which was solely a part of Czechoslovakia. But in 1939, they took over the entire nation of Czechoslovakia. This is a good opportunity to talk more about why the League of Nations was bound to fail. Their failure was unavoidable. They were going to fail no matter what happened. They were too lenient. Nazi Germany already violated the terms of the treaty. So firstly, they already violated the terms of the treaty. If they were a strong organization, by then they would have done something already because Nazi Germany did not do what they were supposed to do with the treaty. They didn't stay within the confines of their punishments for World War I. Afterwards, Nazi Germany started taking over land in other nations, finding up all kinds of reasons to justify them taking over that land. But they still stayed quiet. I will stop the class and I will continue next time. Thank you, everyone.